Hero Time by Emrys the Merlin, Chapter 1, The Return. Jennifer Tennyson smiled to herself. Then she frowned up at the bleachers. Grandpa Max had said he would be there for her today. It was the last game of the season, after all. But he hadn't been there, not even showing up late to see her get her MVP medal. But she shook her head and pulled the key to her bike lock out of the gym bag slung over her shoulder. She was so distracted she almost didn't notice the person standing next to the bike stand. She glanced up and blinked. He was cute. His hair was a wave of black, carefully pulled back into a ponytail, and his eyes were an unusually bright purple. He smiled a perfectly white smile at her. That was an excellent save. Jen grinned, her hand going to the medal around her neck. Thanks. Then she frowned slightly, brushing her short hair out of her eyes. Don't think I've seen you around before. The boy, he looked about her age, maybe 16, smiled. I am a new transfer to Bellwood High. I'm starting this week. My name is Al. Jen smiled and held out her hand, pulling off her goalie glove. I'm Jen. He smiled at her and took her hand. It is wonderful to meet you. That's when he did something odd. Instead of shaking her hand, he brought it up to his mouth and very gently kissed the back. She pulled her hand back. He frowned. My apologies, I did not wish to offend you. Jen shook her head, pink dusting her cheeks. A part of her brain was going off like an alarm. Over the past 5 years, she'd kept an eye out for unusual behavior. Grandpa Max had drilled both her and Gwen in techniques to keep an eye out for alien activities. Out of usual behaviors could be an easy sign. Al rubbed the back of his head, looking sheepish. He did have a bit of an exotic accent. Maybe he was just from somewhere else, on Earth. Jen blushed a bit more and shook her head. Just not a greeting I'm used to. Sorry. She got her bike lock undone, shoved it into her bag, and stepped onto her bike. I truly meant no harm. Jen nodded at Al slightly, her hand going to an empty wrist as if searching for something. Instead, she tugged her sleeve down. Yeah, sorry, I've gotta go. With no more preamble than that, she took off on her bike. Al watched her go as a woman stepped out of the shadows of a nearby tree. You are sure that is her? She was not wearing the Omnitrix. Al nodded at the woman, still watching the retreating figure of the girl in her soccer gear. I am sure. Omnitrix or not, that is Gen 10. She's quite pretty in person. Finding the rest bucket empty, save for an alien Jen had never seen before that tried to kill her on sight, was not the way she wanted her day to go. Finding the holo viewer from Grandpa Max saying he had the Omnitrix made her heart race in fear. The watch was dangerous, she knew that more than others. After everything they had gone through to get it off of her, how could Grandpa Max have just taken it? She biked home, breaking several laws about the bike lane and respecting traffic on the way. She ran through the house, shouting an apology over her shoulder at her mother as she dove for her closet. Slamming it open, she tore into the mess there. When her hands came into contact with the box she'd hidden the watch in, nearly 6 years ago, she stilled. She swiped a hand across the lid and laid her hand on the scanner inside. There were 3 people and 1 Galvin in the universe who could open this box. Herself, Grandpa Max, Gwen, and Asna. She tossed aside the lid and the Sumo Slammer's cards and frowned. With a careful hand, she picked up the watch. The weight was familiar in her hand, almost comforting. Then she slipped the holo viewer out of her pocket. What did you mean? She had a choice to make. She stood and set the watch down on her desk, and sat in front of it. After a few minutes contemplating the thing, she made up her mind. She changed clothes quickly, running a brush through her hair. It was short, boy short, and shaved on the sides. She'd learned her lesson about long hair years ago. Of course, she couldn't exactly tell her mother that she'd come home from her summer trip with Grandpa Max and Gwen with extremely short hair because she'd been dragged around by her long hair during a fight with one of the most brutal tyrants in the galaxy. It definitely was easier to manage this way, too. She slipped the Omnitrix into her pocket next to the holo viewer and headed out. I'm going to visit Gwen, see how her karate match went. She called over her shoulder to her mother. She was glad that she and her cousin had grown closer over the past 5 years. Of course, some things couldn't be gone through without ending up as friends. saving the galaxy several times over and nearly dying every day for a summer, for example. Their talk would have gone better if they weren't interrupted by the Magister accusing Jen of stealing the Omnitrix. She almost put the watch back on right in that second. But the mix-up was cleared up quickly and left the three of them standing in the hall. Jen looked down at the device, still sitting innocently in her hand. It looked so inert like this. Like it really was just a harmless watch. Gwen put a hand on her cousin's shoulder. Jen, do you remember how much trouble we had getting that thing off you last time? I don't know if we'll be able to do it again. Putting it back on has to be your choice. You can't just do it because of some vague message from Grandpa. Are you absolutely sure? Jen nodded and flicked the switch on the back of the watch. It opened effortlessly and she slipped it back around her wrist. It closed on its own with a finality felt by everyone in the room. I'm sure. It could have gone better, Jen mused from her spot at the table at Mr. Smoothie's. Kevin Levin sat nearby, and wasn't that just a kicker? He and Gwen were flirting up a storm that nearly put her off her smoothie. She rolled her eyes and slurped the frozen concoction, and her frown returned full force. She didn't consider today a win. The Magister had died from a wound he'd gotten during their fight with the Forever Knights. She would never consider a lost life a win. She wondered if the others did. She shook her head. Kevin kept glancing down at the Magister's badge. After a few more minutes, they all fell silent. Jen stood and threw her empty cup into the garbage can. Glancing around, she confirmed that the parking lot was empty. I'm going to find Grandpa Max. I'm going after these aliens. There have to be more of them on Earth. I'm going to crack this case wide open and get justice for the Magister. I'm not going to ask you to come with me, but I could use the help. Gwen jumped off the hood of Kevin's car and smiled, pulling her cousin into a hug. Jen was about a head shorter than her and grumbled slightly as her short hair was ruffled by her cousin. I've always got your back. They grinned at each other and Jen held out a hand. Her cousin put her hand on top of Jen's. Both girls were a little surprised when a larger hand joined theirs. They looked up into the dark eyes of Kevin Levin. If you can give me a second chance, I want to get back at the guys who killed the Magister, too. Jen grinned. All right, but I've got my eye on you, Levin. He rolled his eyes and Jen turned away from the group. She stepped up to the window and ordered a second round of smoothies. Once they were gone, though, Jen stood again and walked away from the others. I'm heading home. I've got classes in the morning. Kevin snorted at her. Oh, yeah. I forgot that's a thing normal kids our age do. Jen rolled her eyes at the now ex-con. You two be safe. Don't kill each other while I'm gone. She grinned and slipped off into the streets of Bellwood. Jen would never say it aloud, but having the Omnitrix back on her wrist was comforting. The first few months without it had been practically torture, and she would know. She absently rubbed her side. She still had a scar there from Vilgax's sword. She shuddered a little at the thought, and walked a little faster, her hand coming up to the familiar warm metal of the Omnitrix. She let out a breath. Even though the watch had changed, it was still strangely comforting to have it around her wrist again. She frowned, old feelings of paranoia itching at the back of her skull. She turned, but the street behind her was empty. Even so, she took the long way home and circled around until the feeling went away before actually going home. It took her a long time to fall asleep. That night, she spent most of the night fiddling with the Omnitrix, trying to find one alien she recognized. She liked Humongousaur and Swampfire already, but she missed the familiar feelings of being as solid as Diamond Head, the speed she could practically taste as accelerate. But none of them were there. She frowned and buried her head in her pillow, blocking out the toxic green glow of the watch, and eventually falling into a fitful sleep. She dreamed of stars, of a planet teeming with alien life, of a very familiar small scientist, and the last time they'd seen each other. She woke up in a cold sweat and reached for her wrist, half expecting to find it empty, but it wasn't. She sighed in relief. Then she spotted the time on her alarm clock and swore. She vaulted out of bed and dressed as fast as she could, nearly toppling over as she pulled on her sneakers. Racing to school was made slightly difficult as she had left her bike at Gwen's school last night. She just barely made it to the classroom before the bell rang. She was relieved to discover the teacher wasn't even there yet. Her friend Julie laughed as she pumped the air and slid into her desk, depositing her bright green backpack at her feet. Getting a bit close, huh, Jen? Jen stuck out her tongue at her friend, who snorted another laugh as Jen stretched. Nice watch. Jen's grin slipped a little at Julie's words when she tugged her sleeve over the Omnitrix. Thanks. She forced brightness into her voice as she pulled out her notebook and the door opened. Their teacher stepped in, followed by the boy from the soccer field yesterday. God, it felt like it had been years since she'd put the Omnitrix back on, but it hadn't even been 24 hours yet. Quiet down, class. The class did as they were told. We have a new student starting today. She waved him to the front of the class. Introduce yourself. He smiled at the class, his eyes finding Jen and staying there. My name is Al. I look forward to learning from all of you this year. It might have just been Jen's paranoia speaking, but that sounded a little bit ominous. Excellent, take a seat. Looks like there's an open one next to Jennifer. Jen rolled her eyes at the use of her full name. Still Jen, Miss Jackson. The teacher rolled her eyes and motioned for Al to take a seat. He smiled as she began the lesson, and he slipped into the seat next to Jen and took off his bag. Lovely to see you again, Jen. He nodded his head, and Jen felt herself blush under those violet eyes. She nodded too and looked back up at the board. Julie caught her eye and raised an eyebrow, casting an appreciative eye at Al. Jen shook her head at her friend and focused on the lesson. History already wasn't her best subject. She didn't notice Al's eyes fix on the Omnitrix and widen slightly. Jen, may I speak to you for a moment? Al called after her as she stood to leave the classroom. Jen paused with Julie at the door. Her friend bounced her eyebrows at the brunette and flounced out of the classroom. Hey, Al. Sorry if we got off on the wrong foot. He smiled. It is me who should apologize. I was wondering if you could assist me? He held up his class schedule. Jen nodded, and the two of them stepped out into the hallway. She looked down at the schedule in surprise. Your schedule is identical to mine. That's a little odd. Al shrugged. I am still getting used to the American school system. Jen laughed, prepared to be at least slightly disappointed. Come on, our next class is over here. Al followed Jen to their next class a few steps behind the Omnitrix wielder. It was polite, after all, not just because she was showing him where to go, but she was in a higher position of power than him as Asmus chosen. He just had to find the right time to talk to her. Hopefully the Magister would contact them within the next few days and give them the all-clear signal to approach her properly. But it was curious that she had put the Omnitrix back on what had to have been mere hours after they met. He couldn't help but wonder what had happened, but for now he would focus on keeping his cover intact, and that meant passing